a closed door, a stone wall of bureaucracy.
I can never see it. I'm not allowed.
It takes an act of God, relatively speaking, to unseal these records.
And endless questions.
I have no real background
about the past that can't be answered.
There's a basic human need for it. It should be a civil right.
They're teachers, paramedics, social workers, artists, and while they all have different stories,
I am a black market baby.
I have no medical background.
I'd like information about my birth mom.
They have one thing in common.
I was adopted from birth.
I am an adoptee.
And they're crying out for equality.
I think it is a critical basic right
that they say is being denied them.
You're denying someone an opportunity for a government document that everyone else has access to.
What these adoptees are demanding is access to their original birth certificates.
It doesn't make sense that the government says you're old enough to vote, and you're old enough to pay for taxes, and you're old enough to go to college, and you're old enough to start a family, but you're not old enough to see your birth certificate. In fact, you'll never be old enough to see your birth certificate.
In Virginia and many other states, if you're adopted, your birth certificate is sealed away by law.
As citizens of the Commonwealth, as citizens of the United States, adult adoptees ought to have access to their original birth certificate.
I know right away.
Richmonder Sarah Hudson's reunion with her birth mom and 4 full-blooded sisters recently made national headlines. But it was not hopes of a reunion that sparked her search. It was a medical emergency she calls her epic near-fail.
I developed what's called a saddle pulmonary embolism, which is a very large blood clot that got into my chest, in my heart, and in my lungs. And I came within hours of dying. And I was in the hospital, I was in the ICU. People kept asking me, what's your family history? What's your family medical history? That's a reasonable question for people to be asked, and I could only respond with, I don't know.
I don't know. Troy Jackson had to say those same 3 words to his doctor.
I was diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer. I had no real background to give the physicians, no background to give the surgeons, no background to give anybody.
In medical emergencies, that lack of background can be the difference between life and death.
The child has a legitimate interest in their birth certificate. They have a legitimate interest in knowing more about the health history of their family in case that they themselves are hit with an illness.
State Delegate David Toscano introduced this bill during the last General Assembly session that would have given adoptees greater access to their vital records. But it did not pass. The main argument against unsealing the records is privacy for the parents who put the child up for adoption. Toscano hopes to reintroduce the bill with a few tweaks during the next GA session.
We're trying to strike a balance between the legitimate interests of an adoptee and of the original parents.
Where do you find that balance?
Well, that's the hard part.
Rebecca Ricardo, the executive director of Coordinators 2, a local adoption agency, is in a position to see both sides of the argument.
I am an adoptee who was adopted at the age of 3 months, and I'm also a birth mother who placed a child for adoption when I was a teenager.
She believes the records should be unsealed.
I would love to see that changed.
And adds, the stigma of being a single mother is not what it used to be, and most adoptions these days are open.
Because we realize it's important for adopted people to have access to their truth and their information.
But the vast majority of current adult adoptees are not afforded that same level of truth.
It feels like I'm fighting a battle, and it's like a war that doesn't make any sense.
It's a fight they're hoping Virginia lawmakers will settle possibly as soon as this January. Now, just this week out in Illinois, adoptees there were granted access to their birth records. AJ Lagoe, 8 News.